Hi everyone, I'm Professor McBain and welcome back to Chem 100. And welcome back also to our lecture series on radiation, the atmosphere, and global warming. The second video in the series is going to focus on the ozone layer and the hole in the ozone layer. So Sal is exactly correct, of course. And so what I'd like you to take away from that video is a couple of things, which he highlighted as well, which is that light behaves as both a particle and a wave. Particle meaning something like an object, but everything that behaves as like a discrete object, whether large or small, is considered a particle. But light can behave as a wave as well. Okay. And so particles and waves, like their motion, can both be described with speeds, but also with energies. When we talk about light, we understand the energy that light has much better if we think of light as behaving like a wave. Okay. We have this relationship between the wavelength of light and the frequency that that light has. So basically what we're looking at here is that if you have a certain energy associated with an incoming ray of light, then that energy can be calculated. Let's not worry about calculating. Let's just think about that the energy is proportional to the frequency of light. Okay, and so you'll notice that frequency is up here in hertz. But if we think instead about the wavelength, which we were kind of thinking about wavelengths for those of you that played along with the extra credit assignment. So energy is proportional to frequency, but wavelength is inversely proportional to both its frequency and the energy. Okay, which is also something that Sal explained in the video as well. So you can see that these low energy waves all the way over here at this end, right? So this is our radio waves, our TV waves. Like, these are things that aren't going to hurt us. They have low energy, but notice that their wavelengths are actually very long waves, see? And then everything that's high energy actually has these very, very short wavelengths, very small wavelengths, okay? This is what I do want you to take away from this section, is that light behaves as both a particle and a wave, and we can express the energy of that wave and the energy of the light in general, whether we're thinking of it as a particle or a wave, in terms of the frequency, which will be proportional to the energy, or in terms of a wavelength that is inversely proportional to it. Okay, and so then this helps us understand why infrared and red colors tend to be not as dangerous for us, but as soon as we get to ultraviolet waves, this is where we start seeing damage to human tissues. Okay, that's it for this slide, I promise. So now let's bring it back to the sun. All right, so what types of radiation get emitted by the sun? Well, you can see that there's quite a few, but most of them are in the UV, the visible, and the infrared range. Of course, some cosmic rays get to us, some X-rays get to us, but largely this is most of the radiation that reaches us. By the way, I kind of switched to just using the word radiation, but light and radiation are meant to be used interchangeably. When we get closer to finals week and we're talking a lot about HBO's Chernobyl and getting back onto nuclear chemistry topics, maybe I'll hop on and I'll talk about nuclear radiation versus just light as radiation, okay? So on the last slide, I talked to you about how light can behave as both a particle and a wave. And one of the ways that we think of particles that we call light when it behaves as a particle is we call it a photon. Okay, so if you have a large intensity of light, then that means that that light source is basically pushing a bunch of photons your way along the light's pathway. Okay. So moving forward, we can think of the intensity of light, or the amount of light that reaches us, basically as in terms of like how many photons are reaching us. Okay, so if you have very small intensity of light, then there's only so many photons reaching you at that particular energy and wavelength. But if you have a large intensity of light, like you see at the top of the visible solar radiation spectrum, then that means that, well, there's a ton of photons with those particular wavelengths that are reaching you. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about some more particulars of what's going on with this curve. So the yellow regions are the amount of light that actually reaches the Earth's atmosphere across these wavelengths. Okay, so you can see that the majority of light given off by the sun is in the visible range, just as Sal told us in his Khan Academy video. Okay, but the red is the amount of light that actually reaches the Earth's surface. Okay, so all of this is the number of photons of these particular wavelengths that actually end up reaching us. Okay, and so why is there this disparity? Well, it's because some of that light is interacting with the atmosphere, and some of those interactions are stronger than others, right? And so like in general, you can see like, oh, the atmosphere absorbs light, but then you can see these little dips in particular where there's a lot more of that wavelength of light that is getting absorbed by the atmosphere than on average what gets absorbed. Okay, and so what you can see here in blue are the molecules that are responsible for absorbing those wavelengths of light. Let's push forward and let's talk about one of the molecules doing a lot of light absorption, and that is the ozone layer. Okay, so here's another graph that basically shows like how much UV light actually reaches us. Okay, so this entire spectrum here from 280 nanometers of wavelength, which remember that's pretty high energy, to 360 nanometers of wavelength, which is relatively low energy UV. All of this is UV, but from 320 to 360, this is UVA, and from 280 to 320, this is UVB. Okay, and so you can see that UVA does have a certain amount of light that does get absorbed by the atmosphere, but a good portion of UVA light actually does reach the surface of the Earth. Okay, and you can see that UVA is slightly lower in energy. Atmosphere tends to let it through. I mean, some of it gets absorbed by the atmosphere, but the majority of it makes it through to the surface of the Earth. And then UVA is responsible for a bit of tanning and a bit of increased risk for skin cancer, right? That makes sense. Like, it does some damage. And then UVB, you can see that there's still roughly the same amount of UVB that reaches the atmosphere, but there's much, much less of it that actually reaches the surface of the Earth. Okay, and that is because 99% of UVB light gets blocked by the ozone layer. Okay, and this is good news for us because UVB is otherwise higher energy, and it's responsible for sunburns and also increased risk of carcinoma, which is basically skin cancer on steroids. All right, so this is good news for us. Now, if somehow ozone starts getting its concentration in the atmosphere decreased, well, then clearly that's going to be a problem, because if there are fewer ozone molecules to absorb that UVB, then more UVB is going to get through to the surface of the Earth and start causing sunburn and carcinoma for us. But here's one of the other important things. Plants also experience UVB damage, and this leads to crop damage. It leads to deforestation. Like, it can lead to food shortage, which is also a human issue, right? So we want to do everything in our power to make sure that the ozone in the atmosphere stays as high as possible, as high concentration as possible. And so there has been a problem with the hole in the ozone layer in the past. This was a problem more in the 1970s than it is today, because the sorry, just switching pens here. Because in the 1970s, the EPA started enacting really strict regulations on particular chemicals called CFCs. You've probably heard of them. That stands for chlorofluorocarbons, okay? So examples of chlorofluorocarbons include PERC, TCE, chloroform, dichloromethane or methylene chloride. These are all chemicals that we've heard of before, okay? And so what happens is that in the presence of UV light, chlorofluorocarbons will react with ozone and break it down into oxygen, okay? So ozone will absorb UV, but oxygen will not absorb UV light quite as much as ozone will, okay? So this hole in the ozone layer is really just areas in the atmosphere where there happens to be lower concentrations of ozone, okay? And so in the 1970s, the hole in the ozone layer started growing because chlorofluorocarbons were being used by people a lot. And so they were just being used as solvents in hairsprays, in other sort of aerosols. And so the more and more that they were used, well, of course, the more and more that they were released into the atmosphere, and then being very light chemicals that they would rise up to the highest layers of the atmosphere where there's ozone. And then as soon as there's any sort of light to react with, then they do react with the ozone and they break it down into oxygen. So that's a big problem. And so the EPA regulations on chlorofluorocarbons and other refrigerants are actually good for us as people, okay? Both due to skin cancer concerns as well as crop damage concerns, okay? All right, so that's everything with ozone. The next thing that we're going to jump into, we're actually going to skip that on Rayleigh scattering. The next thing that we're going to jump into is going to be how water and carbon dioxide interact with light. We looked at those a few slides back. We saw that there's a bunch of interactions between light and water and light and carbon dioxide, but this is way down here in this longer, lower energy wavelength range, right, in the infrared range. Okay, so I'm going to pause, give you a chance to take a break, get some water, maybe, I don't know, go to sleep and come back to these lectures. And we're going to jump into part 2 when we come back.